Anyway, no study of the book of Judges would really be complete without looking at the most well-known judge of them all, and that is a man named Samson. So today we're going to be wandering through through chapters 13 to 16 of the book of Judges. Now, whenever people think of Samson, they usually have visions of this muscle-bound weightlifter, but he really wasn't all that muscular. Samson was just an ordinary man who had been endowed by God with tremendous physical abilities. Remove God from the equation, and Samson was really a rather weak man. Well, physical strength can be a powerful asset, but just like any other blessing, it can be abused. Well, that was the case with Samson. Instead of using the great strength that he had been given to serve God, Samson was self-willed and he was out to please himself. One of the tragic legacies of sin's infection of the human soul is seen in wasted potential. A star baseball player loses his opportunity to have a great professional career because he can't stay away from cocaine. The brilliant attorney destroys his promising career because he's so greedy that he gets involved in some shady deals. Well, Samson personifies that sad pattern of human life. He was chosen by God even before he was born. He was endowed with tremendous physical strength, but he failed to reach his full potential because he was an undisciplined pleasure seeker. What's really amazing is the fact that God could use him at all. It only goes to show you that God can even use the mistakes that foolish people make to ultimately show his glory. Now, chapters 13 to 18 of Judges concentrate on the tribe of Dan. Dan was one of the more prominent tribes during the 40 years that Israel had spent wandering in the wilderness. But during this period of the Judges, the tribe of Dan seemed rather helpless against the Amorites. It seems that the Amorites had driven the tribe of Dan out of their land, so they moved north in order to find new territory. Well, Samson was a member of the tribe of Dan. And in contrast to the failures of his tribe, we have the record of Samson's exploits. And his achievements are chronicled for us in 4 chapters of the book of Judges. Well, in case you haven't noticed, some of the scripture passages from the book of Judges that apply to these lessons are rather long. So, in the interest of time, we're going to concentrate on some selected verses from these passages. Now, the story of Samson actually begins in chapter 13. And the people of Israel, again, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now, about 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, there were many local wars being fought in the area of the Aegean Sea. And during this unsettled period of history, massive numbers of people were displaced. One particular group were known as the Sea People. They migrated south and they settled along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. These invaders went on to become known as the Phoenicians and the Philistines. Well, the Philistines had settled along the Mediterranean coast in what is now known as southern Palestine. And since they were the strongest of the two groups of sea people, their name was actually the inspiration for the name Palestine. Now, let's have a little history lesson here. Did you know that there has never been a formal nation called Palestine or a people called Palestinians? Palestine was a name that was simply made up. And that patch of real estate has been called Israel, and the majority population of Israel has always been Jewish for thousands of years. Well, who come up with the name? It seems that the nation of Israel had been was constantly rebelling against the Roman occupiers, so they had always been a thorn in the side of the Romans and they controlled the area. Well, in 132 AD, a Jewish man named Koba led a revolt that historians call the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. And just as before, the Romans finally defeated the Jews 3 years later in 135 AD. Well, after 3 years of fighting, there wasn't much left of Israel, and Emperor Hadrian wanted to erase all traces of the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. So he figured that all he had to do to accomplish this was to come up with a new name for Israel. Now, for several hundred years, the Greeks had referred to the area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River as Philistia. So Hadrian decided that since people were used to referring to that area using that Greek name, he would modify the Greek name for that reason and attach it to another recognized region. And he issued an order that says that from that time on, Israel would be known as Syria Philistia. So there has never been a formal nation or people who adopted that name. But Hadrian had to call it something, and a modified Greek name seemed to work for him. Okay, fast forward to the late 50s, and an Egyptian named Yasser Arafat. Arafat was born in Cairo, Egypt on August 24th, 1929. His father was a textile merchant with some Egyptian ancestry, and he lived in what is now the Palestinian territory. His mother was from an old Arab family that lived in Jerusalem. Now, Arafat's father never paid much attention to his children, so Arafat and his siblings were raised alone by his mother. Well, she died in 1934 when Arafat was just 5 years old. So he was sent to live with his maternal uncle in Jerusalem. Now, that area had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire for the past 400 years, and they were Muslims. But even though they controlled the area, they didn't have very much interest in it, so they never really occupied it, and the majority population was still Jewish. But the British forces defeated the Ottomans during World War I at the Battle of Megiddo in October of 1918. And World War I would unofficially end the following month on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. That day was originally celebrated as Armistice Day. Today we call it Veterans Day. Then the war would officially be over when the signing of the Treaty of Versailles at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris on June 28th of 1919. But even though the Ottomans were very weak at the end of the war, they did manage to hold on for a few more years. It seems that one of the nations that the Ottomans still controlled was Turkey. And the Turkish War for Independence began on May 19, 1919, and the Ottomans were deposed by the Republic of Turkey on November 1st of 1922. And during the next 20 years, over 100,000 Jews entered the nation of Israel. So why am I telling you this? Did you notice that there is never a mention of the nation called Palestine or a people called Palestinians? That area has always been populated by Jews who called it Israel. Well, in 1920, the British Army moved into the area to repel attacks by militant Arab groups who opposed this mass influx of Jewish migrants. And the area remained in a British protectorate until 1948, when that area was turned over to the Jews, and a new nation called Jordan was given to the Arabs. Well, the Arabs weren't too happy about that. You see, they weren't satisfied with just having Jordan. They wanted all of the Middle East for themselves. So on the same day that the new nation of Israel was created, the Arabs attacked Israel with the intention of exterminating the Jews and turning Israel into a Muslim country, but the Israelites defeated them. Now, Arafat never said much about his childhood, but he did say that one of the earliest memories that he had was of British soldiers breaking into his uncle's house after midnight and beating members of the family and breaking furniture, but many people claim that Arafat just made that story up. Well, Arafat lived in Jerusalem with his uncle from 1934 to 1938. And then after 4 years in Jerusalem, his father took him to Cairo, Egypt, where his older sister took care of him and his siblings. Now, before Arafat was 16 years old, he was smuggling weapons into Israel to be used against the British and the Jews. Then he dropped out of what would later be the University of Cairo in order to fight Jews in Gaza. After Israel became recognized as a nation in 1948, and the Arabs had been defeated in their attempt to stop that from happening, Arafat was so upset by it that he applied for a visa to study at the University of Texas, but he was denied. So he returned to the University of Cairo to study engineering. But instead of studying, he spent most of his time stirring up trouble and leading the Arab students who were from Gaza in demonstrations against Israel. Well, he did manage to graduate in 1956, but in 1958 he went to Kuwait, and he and his friends founded a terrorist group called Al-Fatah, and they published a magazine that advocated an armed struggle with Israel. Then at the end of 1964, Arafat left Kuwait, and he became a full-time terrorist who planned raids in Israel and Jordan. And in the same year, with the sponsorship of the Arab League, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed, better known as the PLO. Well, in 1967, after being defeated again by Israel in the Six-Day War, Fatah managed to take over control of the PLO, and this put Arafat in charge of the largest terrorist organization in the world. By the way, prior to that, the city of Jerusalem was a divided city, much like Berlin was. But that victory gave Israel a full control of Jerusalem once again, and they've never given it back up. Then in 1987, a Sunni Muslim group called Hamas was formed as a rival to the Shia-controlled Fatah. Today, Hamas is thought to be the dominant force in the Palestinian territory because they control the Gaza Strip, while Fatah controls the smaller West Bank. Well, in 1996, Fatah was still a top dog, and Arafat was elected president of the Palestinian Authority, which meant that he was the head man. Well, this put him in the world spotlight. So he needed a reason for continuing his terrorist activities against Israel. So he started telling the world that Israel was actually the Palestinian homeland, and that the British had evicted the Palestinians and gave it away to the Jews in 1948, and the PLO were simply freedom fighters who were trying to get their land back. That was all a big lie, but it was a lie that was promoted by the anti-Semitic liberals all over the world who were following in the footsteps of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Well, it's hard to believe, but in 1994, in spite of all his history, Arafat was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. You can't make this stuff up, folks. No. Remember, you can't cure stupidity, and even liberal socialists in this world are infected with a fatal case of it. So there was never a nation called Palestine, and there was never a people called Palestinians. It was all made up by Yasser Arafat to justify his terrorist activities. Now, most of Israel was being controlled by Muslims in the Ottoman Empire for a few hundred years, up until the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. And during that time, the land of Israel, and especially the city of Jerusalem, was left to fall into disrepair because the Arabs had no particular interest in it. And that was mostly because even then, the majority of the people living in that area were Jewish. But when the nation of Israel was founded in 1948, the Arabs wanted the Jews out of the Middle East. In fact, they had worked with the Nazis during World War II in their efforts to exterminate the Jews. Now, there are two Muslim sites in Jerusalem. What is now referred to as the Dome of the Rock was built in 682 AD, and the Mosque of Omar was built in 1193 AD. Both of those buildings were built as a way for Muslims to simply mark their territory, and they held no particular significance beyond that. In fact, when the Ottomans were in charge, the buildings were allowed to fall into disrepair. But Arafat needed something to prove that Israel was actually a Palestinian homeland. So the Mosque of Omar and the Dome of the Rock were suddenly elevated to the status of holy sites, which was a status they had never enjoyed up until that time. Then they made up stories that justified doing that. For example, they claimed that the Dome of the Rock was where Muhammad went to heaven for a visit. But the only thing the Quran says about it is that he ascended from the farthest mosque. That could be anywhere. And in the late 1950s, both buildings were refurbished, and the gold was added to the dome for the Dome of the Rock. Well, all of the stories about Jerusalem being a Muslim holy city are easily proven to be lies, but the anti-Semitic world has swallowed as lies hook, line, and sinker. So if you want to get technical about it, the only true Palestinians are the Jews who occupied the land for about 4,000 years. And even when the Ottomans were in charge, the majority of people living there have always been Jewish. and Yasser Arafat's Palestine that was occupied by Palestinians as a figment of his imagination. But you have to give Arafat credit for one thing. He really pulled the wool over the eyes of the Western media. They believed every word that he said about how the Jews were oppressing them and how the British stole their homeland, and none of it was true. In fact, Hamas is still lying to us today, and the media is still lapping it up. A few weeks ago, one of the Hamas missiles failed as they fired it, and it fell into a schoolyard, damaging a few cars. But Hamas said that it was an Israeli missile and that 500 children had been killed. None of that was true, but the fake news in America never checked to see if Hamas was telling the truth and printed the lie anyway, only to find out later that it was a big lie. Well, none of them will admit that they goofed. Truth is, every Muslim country in the world is a dictatorship, and the people have no freedoms at all, and there is no protection under the law. But the Muslims who live in Israel have the same protection under the law as any Israeli citizen has. They can vote, and they can even be elected to office. So they have more freedom and more civil rights, and they are more protected than they would be in any other Arab country in the world, even though those countries are under Muslim control. You see, all Yasser Arafat really wanted to do was to create a Palestinian state with him as the sole leader, and his successors were no better. In fact, when he died, it was discovered that he had embezzled a few $1 billion from the government in the Palestinian territory and had it stashed in secret bank accounts in France. And ever since then, there has been an ongoing battle between Arafat's widow and his family and Arafat's successor, Mahmoud Abbas, as to who should get the money. The Muslims have already turned the areas that they do control into police states, but we just seem to walk around with blinders on and ignore the reality of the situation. Well, that's enough about Palestine. Let's get back to the Philistines. As I said earlier, the Philistines were a very warlike people, and they harassed the Israelites for over 100 years. But at this point in time, they were also in political control of Israel as well. Now, one reason that the Philistines were so successful was the fact that they had a monopoly on smelting iron. The bronze weapons that everybody else was using at that time were useless against the iron weapons of the Philistines. Now, the story of Samson begins in the city of Zoar. Zoar is located in the foothills about 15 miles west of Jerusalem. Zorah is mentioned 5 times in this account, and it's always mentioned in conjunction with a nearby city of Eshtaol. In verse 2, we are introduced to a man named Manoah. It seems that Manoah's wife shared the same plight as Abraham's wife Sarah and Jacob's wife Rachel did. She was childless. Since the Jews considered children to be a gift of God, to be barren was a sign of God's disfavor. Well, Manoah's wife would have been happy to have just any child, but the angel of the Lord appeared to her and informed her that she was going to bear a very special son. The angel tells her that her son was to be a Nazirite for life. Now, the Nazirite vow is explained in Numbers chapter 6 if you want to read it. It was a vow that was taken voluntarily and usually for a limited period of time. It was taken by people who wanted to temporarily set themselves aside for very special service to God. A Nazirite had to agree to 3 very strict conditions. First, they could not drink anything that has alcohol in it. In fact, they were even forbidden to eat anything that involved grapes. Even raisins were out. Second, they could not cut their hair for the time of the vow. And third, they could not come into contact with a dead body. The violation of these special conditions played an important part in Samson's life. The restriction on the cutting of his hair is especially critical. Now, Samson's mother was also ordered to observe the Nazirite vow as well. We aren't told exactly how long she was to observe the vow, but most likely it was for at least the entire time that she was pregnant with Samson. This was especially important for her because she was the one who did the cooking. So handling any sort of meat was prohibited because in order to do that, she would have to touch a dead animal, and that would cause her to violate the vow. Look at verse 5. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That verse is very significant. Samson's calling would carry a military significance, since he was going to win military victories over the Philistines. But his victory was not going to be total. Notice what it says. And he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. The total deliverance of Israel from the Philistine dominance would be left up to King David. Well, Manoah's wife goes to her husband, and she tells him about her visit from the angel of the Lord. And apparently her husband asked her for the name of this heavenly visitor. But she was in such awe of the angel of the Lord that she didn't say anything to him, much less ask him his name. But apparently Manoah thought it was important enough to ask his name in verses 17 and 18. Well, in verse 8, Manoah prays for a second visit from this man of God. He says that he wants to know exactly how he should raise this special child. But every Jew knew exactly what was involved in living under the Nazirite vow, so Manoah was just using that as an excuse to ask for another visit from God. On the other hand, he may have thought that his wife was just imagining things, and he was simply wanting to confirm her story. I mean, after all, if what she said was true, unless he cooked it himself, he wasn't going to be eating any meat for at least the next 9 months. In any event, the Lord grants his request and sends the angel of the Lord back. But initially, he only appears to the woman again. Even so, Manoah is given the opportunity to confer with him. But the angel of the Lord really doesn't say anything more to Manoah than he had said to his wife during the first visit. About the only thing that was new here is the fact that in verse 14, he goes on one step farther and he adds the detail about not eating anything that comes from the grapevine. Back in verse 4, Manoah's wife was only told to stay away from wine and strong drink. Of course, that doesn't mean that the angel of the Lord had forgotten that little detail in the first visit. You see, the requirements of the Nazirite vow are very clearly spelled out in Scripture, so every Jew was familiar with them because they were taught them from an early age. Now, the fact that the angel didn't answer Manoah's question directly might imply that he thought that his request for a second visit showed a lack of faith on his part. Well, it was customary in that culture to offer a meal to any visitor, so Manoah asked the angel if he would stay and eat with him. Manoah has no idea that he's actually talking to the pre-incarnate Christ. He thought that he was dealing with a prophet, so he had no intention of offering a sacrifice. He was simply going to serve the goat for supper. But the angel tells him to prepare the goat along with some grain as a sacrifice to the Lord. After all, that's who he was talking to. Well, when the sacrifice is prepared, Manoah asks the angel his name, and the angel avoids a direct answer. But he does say, "Why do you ask my name, seeing that it is wonderful?" The prophet Isaiah would write many years later that one of the titles for Jesus would be wonderful. The Hebrew word is poli, and literally means beyond understanding or secret. Well, as the flames from the sacrifice rise to heaven, so does the angel of the Lord. And Manoah and his wife are so amazed that they fall on their faces. They have finally realized that they have been talking to God himself. Well, like the guy that we talked about last week, Gideon, Manoah figures that they're dead meat. And Manoah said to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." But as women will very often do when their husbands get hysterical. But the wife said to him, "If the Lord meant to kill us, he would not have accepted the burnt offering and a grain offering in our hands, or shown us all these things, or now announced to us such things as these." So Manoah finally calms down, and 9 months later they are the proud parents of a bouncing baby boy and name him Samson. In Hebrew, it's Shimshon, which means sunshine. We aren't told anything about Samson's childhood other than the fact that the young man grew and the Lord blessed him. As we begin chapter 14, Samson is a grown man. We also see that Samson's saga begins and ends with in the same way, with Samson displaying a fatal attraction for Philistine women. In the first episode, we see Samson traveling about 4 miles southwest of his hometown of Zorah to the town of Timnah. The fact that he encountered Philistines in Timnah tells us that they had actually occupied parts of Israel. Now, the Philistine rule over Israel seems to be a little bit more subtle and a lot more peaceful. It wasn't anything like the periods of oppression that they suffered through earlier. This is seen in the fact that the people were apparently free to travel, and the fact that they were also free to intermarry with the Philistines. We can see in verse 11 of chapter 15 that even the tribe of Judah was perfectly content to stay under the control of the Philistines. Well, when Samson reaches Timnah, he sees this Philistine woman and is lust at first sight. He sees her and he just has to marry her. Now, in Israel, it was customary at that time for the parents to choose the person their children would marry, or at the very least, they had a strong voice in the decision. It was also the parents who would oversee the negotiations with the bride's family. Well, in Samson's case, he was willing to let his parents make all the arrangements and pay the bills, but only if he was allowed to select the woman. Well, Samson's parents objected very strongly to his choice. You see, Israel had been warned repeatedly not to intermarry with the pagan people around them. They were foreigners, and their idolatry would lead their spouses astray. Mixed marriages have always been disastrous for Jews, and Samson ignores his parents, and he insists on marrying this Philistine girl. His parents said, "Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go to take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines?" But Samson answers rather flippantly, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." In other words, I want to marry her because she's real cute. Seems to me that since Samson's parents knew that he had been chosen by God, they may have spoiled him just a little bit too much. He's talking to his parents like a spoiled brat. Well, even though his parents are convinced that he'll regret his decision, they reluctantly give in, and as crazy as this may sound, the fact that they did give in gives God the opportunity to use Samson. Look at verse 4. His father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. God was allowing this to happen in order to put Samson into contact with the Philistines. Now in verse 5, we see Samson and his reluctant parents traveling to Timnah in order to discuss the marriage arrangements. And along the way, Samson gets the opportunity to demonstrate his great strength. He had apparently left his parents on the main road for a few moments, and he had wandered off into the surrounding area. He may have been searching for firewood, we don't know. Well, while he's doing that, Samson suddenly meets a young lion. Now, the writer may have told us that it was a young lion to let us know that it was easier to kill than a full-grown lion would be. Or he may have wanted to let us know that the young lion may have been stronger than an older lion may have been. But whatever the reason was, the Holy Spirit gave him the strength he needed to kill the lion with his bare hands. Now, Samson didn't tell his parents that he had killed that lion because doing that violated the Nazirite vow. First off, he would have had a tough time explaining where he was. He was in a vineyard on the outskirts of Timnah. And remember, he was supposed to stay away from anything related to grapes. It also meant that he had come into contact with a dead body in the form of the lion that he had just killed. So he figures that the best thing for him to do is to keep his mouth shut. When they finally arrive at the home of this Philistine girl, Samson's desire to marry her is renewed. So they agree on a date for the wedding and they return home. Well, when Samson and his family return to the wedding, Samson goes off to the vineyard again, and he comes across the carcass of that lion that he had killed on the last visit. But it seems that a swarm of bees had taken up residence inside the carcass. Apparently Samson has a bit of a sweet tooth, so he scrapes up some of the honey and he shares it with his parents. Of course, he keeps quiet about the fact that he was in the vineyard again and that he had come into contact with a dead body of that lion in order to get the honey. Then after they had tickled their sweet tooth, they go to Timnah, and verse 10 says that Samson made a feast there. Well, it was customary in those days to have a wedding feast. Today we call it the wedding reception. But in those days, it was paid for by the father of the groom, and it usually lasted for 7 days. In those days, people weren't in a hurry to do anything. So what's so significant about this? Well, it's significant because of the fact that it was Samson who was giving the feast. You see, the word translated feast in that verse is the Hebrew word mishta, which means place of drinking. It was a drinking party. Samson was violating his Nazirite vow again. Well, the only people that Samson had brought along with him to the wedding were his parents, so the bride's family supplied him with 30 companions to make up the wedding party. Samson hadn't brought any clothes with him either. So the Philistines' guests were probably complaining about the way he was dressed. Or since he'd been messing with the carcass of that dead lion on the way there, it probably didn't smell very good either. So Samson comes up with a way to get some new clothes. And Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Put your riddle, that we may hear it." Now, solving riddles was a very common form of entertainment in those days. So Samson bets that his 30 Philistine companions that they can't solve the riddle before the wedding feast is over. And just to make it interesting, Samson offers a bet. If they can answer the riddle, he promises to give them 30 suits of clothes. If they can't, then they owe him 30 suits of clothes. Well, in those days, clothing was handmade, and it was very expensive. So the 30 companions found Samson's bet very attractive. If they lost the bet, they only owed 1 suit each. But if Samson lost it, he owed 30 suits. And besides, they had a week to figure out the riddle, and they felt that they were smarter than any Israelite was, so they figured that they were sure to win the bet, so they agreed. Well, Samson gives them the riddle in verse 14. "And he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." The fact that the riddle rhymes in English is purely accidental. But the answer to Samson's riddle is that dead lion and the honey that was in it. So there is no way that anybody but Samson would know the answer. And Samson knew that. So the whole thing was a little bit dishonest. Well, after 3 days, they still hadn't been able to figure it out, so they start to get a little nervous. And they aren't going to let this upstart Israelite embarrass them by coming up with a riddle that they can't solve. So they get a little bit dishonest themselves. On day 4, they go to Samson's new Philistine wife, and they ask her to weasel the answer out of him. Well, like I said, there was no way for anyone but Samson to know the answer to that riddle. And Samson's new wife doesn't seem to be having any luck getting the answer out of him either. So in desperation, they threaten Samson's new wife. They tell her to find out the answer to the riddle, or she and her whole family would be killed. So in order to save her family, Samson's new wife turns on the strongest weapon a woman has, tears. She goes to Samson and she turns on the tears, and she said this in verse 16. "You only hate me. You do not love me. You've put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is." And she does the same thing every day for the balance of the 7 days. Well, Samson tells her, "Behold, I've not even told my father nor my mother, and shall I tell you?" But living with a crying woman day after day can get a little bit unnerving. So Samson finally gives in and tells her the answer to the riddle, and she promptly tells her those 30 companions. Well, armed with the answer to the riddle, the 30 Philistine companions come to Samson before the deadline, and they announce that they have won the bet. The answer is in verse 18. "What is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion?" Since his wife was the only other person on the face of this planet who knew the answer, there was no doubt about where they had gotten it. So Samson says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. Heifers were not used for plowing. So Samson is telling them that he knows that they cheated. Of course, he overlooked the fact that he had cheated too. Well, in retaliation, Samson travels over 20 miles to the coast city of Ashkelon, and empowered by the Holy Spirit, he overcomes 30 well-dressed Philistines, and he takes their clothing to pay off the bet. Obviously, Samson had gone to Ashkelon in order to conceal what he was doing. Now, Samson is still boiling mad at his new wife for spilling the beans, and he goes back to his father's house for a while to cool off. And I'm sure that she told him how she had been threatened. In any case, he returns to claim her, and he brings a young goat as a peace offering. But when he arrives, he finds out that the Philistines have cheated him again. And this brings us to chapter 15. Samson has returned to Timnah during the wheat harvest. They would have been in late May or early June. And it's possible that he chose this time of the year because most of the men would have been busy with the harvest. Well, because verse 1 of chapter 15 says that Samson was going to visit his wife, there are some commentators who feel that Samson's marriage was what is known as a Bina marriage. Bina is an Akkadian word that means visit. It's the type of marriage the wife would have in that type of marriage, the wife would have a dwelling place of her own, and she would continue to live with in her father's house, and she would be visited by her husband periodically. This type of marriage was common whenever a man would marry a woman who was of a different race or of a different nationality. Doing it this way, Samson's Philistine bride would have avoided the in-law problems that would have been caused by her presence among the Israelites. Now, if this was a Bina marriage, a young goat would have been an acceptable present to bring to her family. And that's what Samson brought. And besides, Samson also wanted to atone for deserting his wife on their wedding day. Well, when Samson announces his intention to go to her room and finally consummate the marriage, his father tells him that she is no longer his wife. Father says, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. The fact is, he just didn't like the idea that his daughter was marrying an Israelite. Now, since it was customary in that day to buy your bride, that meant that Samson had paid a pretty penny for her. So she had been bought and paid for, and she belonged to him. And her father had no right to give her to someone else. But now he's between a rock and a hard place. If he returned his daughter to Samson, he would have her new husband to answer to. But if he doesn't return her, he has to deal with Samson, and Samson has the law on his side. So the father offers Samson what he says is a more beautiful younger daughter, but Samson wants no part of it. And he sets out to get revenge on the Philistines. Now Samson probably had every right to be upset. In verse 6, even the Philistines were still referring to him as the son-in-law of the Timnite. So even they recognized his claim to be the woman's rightful husband. Now, it was true that he had not consummated the marriage right away, but that wasn't grounds for a divorce, especially a divorce that had been initiated by the girl's father. Later on, David didn't hesitate to take back his wife, Michal, when Saul had given her to another man. But Samson didn't even attempt to get his wife back. Apparently, he was more interested in being offended by what happened than he was in actually having the girl. Well, Samson told all of the Philistines responsible for his insult that he planned his revenge. First, he captured 300 foxes. The Hebrew word is shual. It can just as easily refer to their cousins, the jackals. And it makes more sense to say that these animals were jackals because jackals travel in packs, and that would have made it a lot easier to accumulate 300 of them. I mean, either way, capturing 300 of them wouldn't have been an easy thing to do. It would have taken quite some time to catch that many animals. And the first ones captured would have to be penned and fed until the number reached 300. Well, after the 300 foxes or jackals were gathered, Samson divided them into pairs. Then he ties a cord around the tails of each pair, and he attaches a slow-burning torch to the cord. Then he turns them loose in the fields of dry wheat that were about to be harvested. The fire spread so quickly that the entire wheat crop was destroyed. The fire also spread into the vineyards and the olive groves. When we read in Exodus chapter 22 that burning crops was a serious crime, and the Philistines were rather upset by this blow to their economy. Look at verse 6. Then the Philistines said, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines retaliated by burning to death Samson's wife and her father. Apparently the Philistines blamed Samson's father-in-law and his wife for what Samson had done. And ironically, this is the fate that she had tried to avoid by getting Samson to reveal the answer to the riddle. Well, it didn't take long for the feud to escalate. Look at verse 7. And Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will avenge on you, and after that I will quit." Well, even though it was Samson's intention to stop as soon as he had gotten even, neither side stopped until Samson and several thousand Philistines were dead. It's amazing how quickly the effects of sin and hatred will spread and how destructive they are. Well, verse 8 says, "And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow." Most likely Samson went out and killed the men who were responsible for the death of his wife. This would mean that it happened in the area of Timnah, but it served to arouse the wrath of all the Philistines. Well, anticipating the Philistines' reaction, verse 8 goes on to tell us that Samson takes refuge in a cave near Edom. This is probably a town in southern Judah. Well, the Philistines were determined to get Samson. So they assembled an army and they head for Judah, and they set up camp in an area called Lehi. Apparently, this was a place that where Samson had killed all those Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, because in Hebrew, Lehi means jawbone. Well, when the Philistines get there, the men of Judah become curious as to why a Philistine army is camped on their doorstep. So they send a delegation to find out what their intentions are. They explain that they have come to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us. In other words, they were going to get revenge on Samson. Well, the men of Judah are interested in getting stuck in the middle of a feud between Samson and this Philistine army. So knowing Samson's reputation as a very strong man, they aren't going to take any chances with him, so they send 3,000 men to a cave in Edom to get him. Now, just as a footnote here, their actions are a dead giveaway as to how willing the Jews were to maintain the status quo. And they were willing to do this in spite of the fact that it meant that they would have to accept the continued domination of the godless Philistines. They are perfectly content to have the Philistines controlling Israel. They have just been presented with the opportunity to rally around their hero and divide and drive the Philistines out of Israel, but they're satisfied to maintain the status quo. They meekly bow to the wishes of the Philistines, and they go to Edom and get Samson, and they turn him over to the Philistines, even though they know that it meant his death. Now, notice this. In verse 10, the Philistines justify their actions against Samson by saying, "We have come up to bind Samson to do to him as he did to us." Then in verse 11, Samson justifies what he did by saying, "And they did to me, so I have done to them." See, the whole thing's personal. It has nothing at all to do with God's commissioning Samson to deliver Israel from the Philistines. They are all out to get revenge. This is why Paul wrote, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." Someone hits you, you hit them back. Someone hits you again, and you hit them back again. Then they hit you again. See, when does it stop? That scenario can go on forever. Well, it stops when someone decides to stop seeking revenge and just let it drop. Well, Samson realizes that if he refuses to go, the Philistines will just take it out on the people of Judah. So in order to save them from having to deal with the Philistine army, Samson agrees not to resist, but only if they promise not to kill him. You see, Samson has no desire to fight his own countrymen. Well, they tie Samson up with the strongest ropes that they can find, and they turn him over to the Philistines. And the Philistines start their victory celebration right away. I mean, they're hooting and hollering all over the place. Well, the Holy Spirit suddenly comes on Samson again, and he snaps those ropes like string, and he grabs another donkey jawbone that was just lying nearby and proceeds to kill 1,000 Philistine soldiers with it. You see, it seems that there's always a donkey jawbone laying around when you need one. Well, any of the Philistines who survived probably ran for their lives. Again, the men of Judah had the chance to rally behind Samson and follow up on this victory by throwing off the Philistine domination, but they refused. Well, to celebrate his victory, Samson makes a little poem, recorded for us in verse 16. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, have I struck down 1,000 men. Then in verse 17, he throws the jawbone away, and he renames the place Ramath Lehi, which literally means Jawbone Hill. Well, at this point, Samson starts acting like a spoiled brat that he is. He's exhausted after the battle, and he wants to drink a drink of water. So he sits down and he starts complaining to the Lord. You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? He never even says thank you. He's just complaining because he's thirsty. Well, God splits open a rock and water comes out, and Samson has the drink that he wants. Then, after he has quenched his thirst, Samson names the spring En-Hachor, which means caller's spring. Probably should have named it complainer's spring. Now I want you to notice verse 20. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. That's an odd place to put a statement like that. I mean, we've got a whole chapter left to go, and this verse sounds as though Samson's tenure as a judge in Israel is over. Well, it is. You see, Samson's tenure as a judge in Israel probably lasted between 1075 and 1055 BC. This was the same time that Samuel's ministry was underway. Since Samson didn't exercise judicial functions as such, the people may have turned to Samuel as their leader during the years after the victory at Jawbone Hill. In any case, Samson's stature as a judge in Israel was over before we see the tragic events of chapter 16. I see God can use man's sinful actions to accomplish his will. But that doesn't negate the consequences of those sinful actions. And this brings us to the final episode of Samson's life. Chapter 16 confirms Samson's great strength once again. And it also confirms his great weakness for Philistine women. Now, a number of years have passed before Samson dared to venture into Philistine territory again. But in verse 1 of chapter 16, we find him on the way to Gaza, which is the closest Philistine city to Israel. Well, as soon as Samson arrives in Gaza, he picked up a prostitute for the night. See, he hasn't really changed a bit. Well, Samson's reputation is well known to the people in Gaza, so his presence doesn't stay secret for very long, and they decide to kill him. But they know that they have to be very cautious about how they do it. And they decided that the safest thing to do was to lock the city gates and kill him in the morning. Now, once the gates were locked, they all went to bed. They seemed to feel confident that the gates would hold Samson until morning. Samson wakes up about midnight. He tries to leave, but he finds that the massive city gates are locked. But those gates don't create much of a problem for him. He simply tore the gates off the hinges, and he carried the gates along with the gate posts and the heavy metal crossbar that was used to reinforce the gates, and he deposited them 38 miles away at the top of a hill near the city of Hebron. Then Samson went to the valley of Sorek, which wasn't far from his hometown of Zorah. Now, Sorek means choice vine. Looks like Samson's Nazirite vow is going to be broken again. While he's there, Samson's weakness for women of low character surfaces again. He makes his downfall in the form of a woman named Delilah. Foreign women seem to carry a strange attraction for Samson. Now, Delilah is never identified as being a Philistine woman, but the fact that she was living in the area occupied by the Philistines and that she was in such close contact with the Philistine leaders, it's a good indication that she was one of them. Well, when the Philistine leaders find out that Samson is in the area, they are determined to capture him. But they also realize that they need to neutralize his tremendous strength if they ever hope to do that. So they approach Delilah with a proposition. Instead of threatening her like they did Samson's wife, each of the 5 leaders of the Philistines offer her 1,100 pieces of silver if she can find out the secret of Samson's strength. 1,100 pieces of silver was a substantial amount of money. It would be about 700 pounds of silver. In today's money, that's about $120,000. You see, the Philistines figured that Samson's strength must come from some magic potion he drinks or some magic charm that he wears, and if they can just find out the secret formula and they can keep Samson away from it, then they would be able to capture him. Well, Delilah is more interested in the money than she is in Samson, so she sets out to find out his secret. And the irony is, Samson knows exactly what she's up to. But you see, Samson knew that there wasn't any magic formula or magic charm. He didn't think that there was any way that he would ever lose his strength. He had forgotten that his strength came from God and that God could take his strength away from him anytime he wanted to. At first, Samson has some fun with Delilah by making things up. He tells her that he would lose his strength if they banged him with 7 fresh bowstrings. Well, the Philistine lord supplied the bowstrings, and then when Samson fell asleep, Delilah used them to tie him up. Then she had some Philistine soldiers hide in her room. Well, when she thought that he was helpless, she calls out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." This is probably a test. If the cords work, then she would turn him over to the soldiers that were hiding in her room. But Samson simply broke the cords. Well, Delilah turns on the hurt lover routine and the tears. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." Sound familiar? I mean, that's the same routine as his wife used on him. Well, Samson gives her another story. Verse 11. "And he said to her, if they bind me with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like other men." Past experience should have told her that wouldn't work. The 3,000 men of Judah that had tied him up with new ropes back in chapter 15 hadn't worked. But maybe Delilah figured that those Israelites just didn't know how to tie knots as well as the Philistines did, so she tries it anyway. She tests the binding again by crying out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," and the men lying in ambush were in the inner chamber. But he snapped the ropes off with his arms like a thread. Well, Delilah complains again that Samson is mistreating her. But this time, her complaining is more intense. And this time, he comes dangerously close to the truth. And he says to her, "If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with a pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man." Now this time it says that she waited until Samson was asleep before she did what he said. Personally, I think she waited for Samson to go to sleep before she tied up any of those things to him. Well, after she had fastened Samson's hair to the loom and fastened it together with the pin, she cries out, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." Well, Samson pulled his hair off the pegs and as easily as you pull up a tent peg. Well, this time Delilah is really mad. Philistine soldiers have gotten disgusted and gone home. But Delilah wasn't going to give up. She wanted the money. In fact, she drove Samson nuts with her constant nagging. Then in verses 15 to 17 it says, and she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me 3 times, and you have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words day after day and urged him, his soul was vexed to death, and he told her all his heart. Now, obviously, Samson wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. He should have known what was going on here. But instead of breaking off his relationship with Delilah, he let his relationship with her break him. He says, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like other men. Now, I cannot believe that Samson actually thought that cutting his hair would cause him to lose his strength. I mean, after all, he had violated every other part of the Nazirite vow, and he hadn't suffered any ill effects. So why should this one be any different? But not cutting his hair was the only part of his vow that he had never broken. And you just can't take your commitment to God that lightly. If the truth be known, his hair didn't have anything at all to do with his strength. His strength came from God and not from his hair. And by violating his Nazirite vow, in essence, he was mocking God. God is very gracious to us, and he will bless us in spite of our rebellion, but there's nothing that says that he must do that. Well, Delilah realizes she may have something here, so she persuades the Philistines to return at least one more time. And when Samson falls asleep, she has one of the Philistine soldiers come in and shave his hair off. And this time, when Delilah cries out, the Philistines are upon you, Samson, he jumps up as usual, ready to fight. But this time his strength was gone. And it wasn't because his hair was gone. It was because God was gone. Then at the end of verse 20, we read some of the saddest words in the Bible. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. See, Samson's strength wasn't in his hair. It was in his Lord. There are many times when we don't do the things that we know God wants us to do, and God continues to bless us anyway. But there will come a day when God will reach the end of his patience, and he will stop blessing us in order to get our attention. We cruise along not knowing that God has left us. Only a truly repentant heart will get him back. Well, the Philistine soldiers aren't taking any chances. They move in quickly and they put out Samson's eyes. They figured that even if his strength does return, if he's blind, they'll still have some control over him. Then they chain his feet. And then they force him to work at a mill in Gaza grinding grain. Since grinding grain was women's work, they forced Samson to do it in order to humiliate him. He would be on public display, and people would walk by throwing insults at the strongest man in Israel. Now, if you remember, Gaza is the city where he tore the gates off the city wall and carried them 38 miles away to the mountaintop. Well, the Philistines allowed Samson's hair to grow back. It's possible that they wanted to take advantage of what they thought would now be a controllable strength. But as Samson's hair grew, so did his repentance, and his strength grew with his hair. Now, the capture of Samson had led to great rejoicing among the Philistines. And since they had a national feast coming up to honor their god Dagon, they decided that it would be nice to put their prize on display before their god. Now, Dagon was the chief god of the Philistines. He was the god of grain, and he was supposed to dwell in the sea. In fact, he's very often depicted as a man with the body of a fish. In some ancient texts, the god Baal is described as being the son of Dagon. Well, the Philistines attributed the capture of Samson to the power of Dagon, but they couldn't be more wrong. Dagon had nothing at all to do with Samson's capture. After all, Dagon was just a figment of somebody's imagination, but Samson's God was real. He was captured because Samson's sinfulness had caused God to temporarily abandon him. Well, the Philistines remembered all the things that they had suffered at the hands of this man. So they must have found it amusing to have a small boy lead Samson around like a dog on a chain. Well, Samson asked the boy to take him to the center pillars of the building so that he can rest against them. At this point, God allows Samson to get revenge on his Philistine tormentors. He prays and asks God to give him his strength back one last time, and God grants his request. Then Samson places his hands on the 2 pillars that support the roof of the building, and he pushes the pillars over. This causes the entire building to come down crashing on top of him. But the 3,000 Philistines who were in the building died along with him. Samson had managed to kill more Philistines in that one single act than he had killed in his entire lifetime. He gladly died with them rather than continue his miserable existence. Samson lived during a time when the Israelites seemed to be content to be dominated by the Philistines. This peaceful coexistence was a threat to the future of Israel as a people. That's why God raised Samson. Samson's exploits may have coexisted with the Philistines a lot less comfortable. Samson was the last of the military leaders mentioned in the book of Judges, and he held the post for 20 years. The Lord wanted him to begin the process of delivering the Israelites from the Philistine domination. This prevented him from being absorbed into the Philistine culture. But he didn't allow Samson to destroy them totally. You see, the people had never repented of their sins. So God wasn't going to release them from Philistine dominance until they did. Samson accomplished this in spite of his flaws. His reward was to be numbered among the heroes of faith mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11. You know, Samson's really a paradox. He has everything going for him. His birth was announced by God himself. His parents dedicated him as a Nazirite for life, which meant that his whole life was to be dedicated to serving God. He was given superhuman strength. He began to release his people from the hold of the Philistines had over them. And he's listed as a hero of faith in the book of Hebrews. But in spite of all those pluses, Samson was really a spiritually weak man. He repeatedly violated his vow to God, not to mention breaking a lot of God's laws on top of that. He allowed sexual sin to get control of his life. He confided in the wrong people, and he tended to use the gifts of God had given him unwisely. Well, what does that say to us today? First, having great strength in one area of your life is no guarantee that you won't be weak in another area. Second, God's presence in your life doesn't mean that you won't need to use your own good judgment. Third, God can still use a person in spite of their mistakes. Samson performed his greatest feat when he was at the lowest point of his life. In fact, even in his death, he still furthered God's purpose of freeing Israel from Philistine control. This should tell us that God will very often wait for us to hit rock bottom before he begins to work through us. You see, when you're at the bottom, there's no place to go but up. Your strength is gone, and that's when you need to rely on God the most. That's where Samson was when God used him the most.